Ain't no hatred of our brown brothers up in here. I love the Mexicans.
Yes, sir.
You didn't hear me.
Yes, sir.
I'm gonna say it again. I ain't hiding none of my feelings. I know who they are.
The year was 1609 on the rugged terrains of Veracruz, Mexico. The colonial power of Spain had had enough of a tribe known as the Cimarrones, or the Maroons, and their leader, an old warrior they called Yanga. With all their might and heavy artillery, the Spaniards were run off by the guerrilla tactics of the Maroons, forced to negotiate freedom with the very Africans they once enslaved. In this video, we will talk about the brutal history of slavery in Mexico, how they ended up with over 200,000 African slaves, and why African Americans and Mexicans have so much in common. Do you think slaves were treated better in Mexico than in America? Stick around to the end to find out. Make sure you hit those like, share, and subscribe buttons. The history of chattel slavery in Mexico is a multifaceted narrative that intervenes with the broader history of the Atlantic slave trade and the Spanish colonial empire. But why were slaves needed in Mexico? If you didn't know, Spanish is not the native language of Mexico. The language, as well as Catholicism, was forced upon them by the Empire of Spain. The colonization began with the arrival of the Spanish conquistador, Hernán Cortés, in 1519. Prior to his arrival, Mexico was home to numerous advanced civilizations, including the Aztec, Maya, Mixtec, and Zapotec. The Aztec Empire, centered in Tenochtitlan, modern-day Mexico City, had complex social structures, sophisticated agricultural systems, impressive architectural achievements, and rich cultural traditions. Tenochtitlan, with its sprawling temples and bustling markets, was a marvel, a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of the Aztec people. The Aztec empire grew, city by city, through blood and gold. Their rulers were seen as gods among men, guiding their people with a divine mandate. The Aztecs were builders of dreams. Their architecture, grand and imposing, reflected their vision of the cosmos. They were also masterful traders, their markets teeming with goods from the farthest reaches of their empire. The Aztecs' culture, rich and complex, was woven from the threads of art, astronomy, and ritual. They crafted intricate calendars, blending the cycles of the sun and the sacred, guiding their lives by the stars. By the dawn of the 16th century, the Aztec Empire was a colossus, casting a long shadow over central Mexico. But within its grandeur lay the seeds of its downfall. The empire's reliance on tribute and its relentless conquests sowed discontent among the subjugated. The arrival of Hernán Cortés in 1519 was not merely a meeting of worlds, but a clash of destinies. Hernán Cortés landed on the eastern coast of Mexico and began his expedition inland. His small force of around 600 men, aided by native allies and superior weaponry, managed to forge alliances with various indigenous groups who were enemies of the Aztecs. The conquest culminated in the siege of the Aztec capital in 1521. The Spanish victory was facilitated by the spread of diseases like smallpox. Sounds familiar, right? The fallen empire and conquered lands were renamed New Spain. It encompassed not only present-day Mexico, but also large parts of what are now the southwestern United States, Central America, the Caribbean, and the Philippines. And like any newly acquired land, it needed a lot of work. The Spaniards believed that conquering the Aztecs would grant them access to large amounts of gold, silver, and other valuable resources. Their plans were to subjugate their indigenous captives of war into a labor force for their enterprises, providing a steady stream of wealth flowing back to Spain. As the Spanish settled in New Spain, they brought with them some Bantu African workers as slaves. This would be a glimpse of things to come. Want good luck? Share this video with 5 people for good luck for the next 5 years. In 1542, the Spanish crown prohibited the enslavement of indigenous people, but that did not include Bantu African workers. The economy of New Spain was heavily based on mining, particularly silver extraction. The discovery of rich silver deposits transformed New Spain into one of the wealthiest and most important colonies in the Spanish Empire. Silver mining required a large labor force, and with the indigenous people no longer available, the Spaniards turned their eyes to the west coast of Africa. The transatlantic slave trade was a massive and brutal enterprise. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homeland, transported across the Atlantic Ocean under horrific conditions, and sold into slavery in the Americas. New Spain became a significant destination for African slaves.
Men and women were separated. Men typically were held in the lower belly of the ship. The roof, if you would, was quite low, probably about 4 feet high. So people couldn't stand. African men were shackled together and they were packed so closely together in a spoon-like position. And they would stay like that for pretty much the entire journey.
The Middle Passage, the transatlantic journey from Africa to the Americas, was notorious for its brutality. Slaves were packed tightly into the holds of ships, with little room to move and inadequate provisions. Their journey could take several weeks to months, during which many slaves succumbed to disease, malnutrition, and mistreatment. It is estimated that up to 20% of the slaves did not survive the voyage. Those who did survive were tasked with being the driving force behind building this arm of the Spanish Empire. African slaves brought to Mexico primarily came from West Africa and the Congo-Angola region. They were captured through warfare, raids, and trading networks that extended deep into the African interior. Once captured, they were marched to coastal slave forts, where they were held until they could be loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. Upon arrival in the ports of Veracruz and Acapulco, the primary entry points for African slaves in Mexico, they were sold at auctions to colonial settlers, mine owners, plantation owners, and other wealthy individuals. Slaves from Africa were considered the means to satisfy the demand for labor to develop new lands. Both male and female Africans were enslaved. Males were used for field labor and physical trades. While women were sometimes used in the field, they also filled numerous domestic service positions, acting as wet nurses, washerwomen, cooks, maids, seamstresses, or personal caregivers of masters and mistresses. The work assigned to African slaves in Mexico varied depending on the region and the economic activities predominant in that area. In regions like Veracruz and Oaxaca, African slaves were primarily used on sugar plantations. The cultivation and processing of sugarcane were labor-intensive and required a large, steady workforce. Africans worked long hours under the harsh tropical sun, often from dawn till dusk, with minimal rest and inadequate nutrition. Many Spaniards deemed the Africans more capable slaves than the indigenous because, unlike the indigenous people, the Africans thrived in the harsh work conditions. However, the grueling nature of the work, combined with the tropical diseases prevalent in these regions, resulted in high mortality rates among slaves. The silver mines of Zacatecas and other areas were another major destination for African slaves. Mining was perilous work. Slaves were required to extract ore from deep within the earth, often using primitive tools and working in dangerous conditions. The risk of cave-ins, exposure to toxic substances, and respiratory diseases were constant threats. Despite the high mortality rate, the Spanish colonial authorities and mine owners continued to import slaves to meet the labor demands of the lucrative mining industry. Many African slaves were also used as domestic servants in the homes of wealthy colonists. These slaves performed a variety of tasks, including cooking, cleaning, and caring for children. Although domestic slaves generally faced less physically demanding labor compared to those in agriculture and mining, they were still subject to the whims and abuses of their owners. Female slaves, in particular, were vulnerable to sexual exploitation and abuse. There were many elements that differ when comparing slavery in New Spain versus chattel slavery in America. One of those differences was that African slaves were at least considered human and had some workers' rights. Under Spanish colonial law, African slaves were considered the personal property of their owners. This legal status meant that slaves had no personal rights and were subject to the absolute authority of their masters. They could be bought, sold, traded, or inherited, much like livestock. However, the colonial legal system included regulations intended to protect slaves from extreme abuse, but these laws were often poorly enforced. The enforcement of these laws was inconsistent, and the exploitation of slaves continued largely unchecked. Despite this, slaves under the colonial legal system could file a complaint for harsh work conditions and mistreatment, which at the very least granted them some rights within society. Socially, African slaves occupied the lowest rung of the colonial hierarchy. They were considered inferior to both Europeans and indigenous people, and this social status was reinforced by pervasive racial prejudices. Despite this, there were instances of social mobility and integration, particularly through intermarriage and manumission. Despite the harsh conditions and legal constraints, African slaves in Mexico resisted their oppression in various ways. Many slaves engaged in subtle forms of resistance, such as working slowly, feigning illness, or sabotaging equipment. These acts of defiance, while often small and individual, collectively undermined the productivity and authority of slave owners. There were also more overt forms of resistance. One notable example was the Yanga Rebellion of 1570. Enjoying our content? Consider becoming a member by clicking that join button. Your contributions help us continue to take deep dives into Black history. Gaspar Yanga was an African prince from the region now known as Gabon. Yanga was captured and sold into slavery enduring the horrific Middle Passage before arriving in New Spain sometime in the mid-16th century. Yanga escaped from a sugar plantation in Veracruz around 1570. Along with a group of fellow enslaved Africans, he fled into the dense mountains near Veracruz. There, Yanga and his followers established a community, a settlement of escaped slaves, known as Cimarrones or Maroons. By the early 1600s, Yanga's Maroon community had grown significantly, posing a threat to Spanish colonial interests. In 1609, the Spanish colonial government decided to put an end to the Maroon settlement. They dispatched a well-armed expedition to crush the Yanga rebellion and recapture the escaped slaves. Yanga, now an elderly man, but still a formidable leader, prepared his community for the impending attack. He proposed a strategic plan that included guerrilla warfare tactics, capitalizing on the familiarity of the mountainous terrain. Yanga and the Maroons, armed with rudimentary weapons and makeshift defenses, fiercely resisted the Spanish forces. The initial encounter resulted in significant casualties on both sides. Despite their limited resources, the Maroons managed to inflict heavy losses on the Spanish. Yanga's leadership and the tenacity of his followers forced the Spanish to realize that a military victory would be costly and difficult. Recognizing the resilience of the determination of Yanga and his community, the Spanish eventually decided to negotiate. In 1618, a treaty was reached that granted the Maroons semi-autonomous status. The Spanish agreed to recognize the freedom of Yanga and his followers and to grant them a piece of land where they could establish their own settlement. The settlement, known as San Lorenzo de los Negros, became one of the first free African communities in the Americas. Today, the city is simply known as Yanga. The abolishment of slavery. Unlike chattel slavery in the Americas, slavery in New Spain, by all accounts, seemed to be a means to an end. One of the earliest calls for the end of slavery in Mexico came from the Catholic Church. Influential figures such as Bishop Bartolomé de las Casas advocated for the rights of indigenous people and African slaves, arguing that all humans were equal in the eyes of God. The Mexican War of Independence was a turning point in the fight against slavery. The decade-long war, sparked by a desire for Mexico to break free from Spanish colonial rule, was characterized by a strong emphasis on social justice and equality. The father of Mexican independence, Miguel Hidalgo, issued the Grito de Dolores in 1810, calling for an end to Spanish rule and the abolition of slavery. Although Hidalgo's revolt was quickly suppressed, his call for abolition resonated with many Mexicans, particularly those of mixed African and indigenous descent. The fight for independence continued under the leadership of José María Morelos, another priest who championed the cause of social equality. In his 1813 document, Sentiments of the Nation, Morelos declared that slavery should be abolished. However, it was not until Mexico achieved independence in 1821 that significant steps were taken toward the formal abolition of slavery. The final push for the abolition of slavery in Mexico came under the leadership of Vicente Guerrero, a national hero of African descent who became president of Mexico in 1829. Guerrero, who had fought alongside Morelos during the War of Independence, was committed to ending the institution of slavery. On September 15, 1829, President Guerrero issued a decree abolishing slavery in Mexico. The decree stated that all slaves within the territory of the Mexican Republic were free, and that any further importation of slaves was prohibited. This landmark decree effectively ended the legal institution of chattel slavery in Mexico, although the transition to freedom was a complex and protracted process. Mexico abolished slavery almost 35 years before the U.S. Africans and their influence over the centuries have become integral parts of Mexico's heritage and culture. African rhythms and dance forms have influenced traditional Mexican music and dance styles, such as the son jarocho from Veracruz and the chilena from Guerrero. Instruments like the marimba and the cajon, which have African origins, are integral to these musical traditions. African culinary practices have also left their mark on Mexican cuisine. Dishes like the mondongo and caldo de camarón have roots in African cooking techniques and ingredients. The syncretic religious practices that blend Catholicism and African spiritual traditions are evident in most Mexican communities. These practices include veneration of saints and the celebration of religious festivals with African-inspired rituals and music. Afro-Mexican communities, particularly in regions like Veracruz, Costa Chica, and Guerrero, have preserved their unique cultural heritage while also contributing to the broader Mexican culture. These communities maintain traditions such as music, dance, cuisine, and religious practices that reflect their African ancestry. The history of chattel slavery in Mexico is a complex and often painful narrative, marked by exploitation, resistance, and resilience. The arrival of African slaves, their treatment under the brutal chattel system, and their eventual emancipation are all integral parts of this history. Despite the hardships faced by African slaves and their descendants, their contributions have had a lasting impact on Mexican society. The recognition of Afro-Mexican communities and their cultural heritage is a testament to the enduring legacy of those who endured and resisted the horrors of slavery. In recent years, there has been a growing recognition of the contributions of African Mexicans to the nation's history and culture. The Mexican government officially recognized Afro-Mexicans as a distinct ethnic group in the 2020 census, a significant step toward acknowledging their historical and cultural significance. As Mexico continues to reckon with its past, the story of chattel slavery serves as a reminder of the importance of justice, equality, and the recognition of the diverse contributions that have shaped the nation's history. All right, folks, let's dive into some of the darkest parts of our history. Picture this, living in a time where even the smallest slip-up could lead to horrific punishments like mutilation or public burnings. That was the brutal reality for millions of enslaved Black people who were stripped of their dignity and treated like mere property. We take our freedoms for granted today, but back then, basic human rights were a distant dream for these folks. They endured unimaginable cruelties, with their bodies and spirits crushed. So let's face these harsh truths, remember the past, and honor those who went through such hellish times. Here are the 10 most brutal punishments inflicted upon enslaved Black people during slavery. Before we get started, please make sure you like, subscribe, and share. 10. The collar. Black people have been perceived as less than human, categorized as cattle and subhuman. One of the instruments used to denote the 3/5 of a human was the iron collar. The iron collar was a harsh form of control used on enslaved Black people. These collars made it difficult to move, sleep, or lie down comfortably. Iron collars varied in design. Some were simple bands of iron that encircled the neck, while others were more elaborate, featuring spikes or prongs that protruded inward or outward. These spikes would dig into the skin, causing pain with every movement. Some collars had chains attached, which could be used to tether the wearer to a post or other fixed object, further restricting their mobility. Beyond the physical pain, the iron collar had a significant psychological impact on enslaved individuals. The constant discomfort and inability to perform basic human functions without pain served as a daily reminder of their lack of freedom and autonomy. This physical torment was an integral part of the system of control exerted by slave owners. Numerous historical accounts document the use of iron collars. For instance, in the narratives of former enslaved individuals, such as Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs, there are descriptions of the brutal punishments endured, including the use of iron collars. These accounts provide a first-hand look at the cruelty inflicted upon the enslaved people. 9. Branding. If you go to any farm, owners who need to keep track of their cattle label their hides with symbols of the owner. This practice was also used on the enslaved as well. Branding involved burning the skin with a heated metal instrument to denote ownership. This was common during the era of Black slavery, particularly in the South. Slaves were often branded with letters or symbols on their faces or shoulders to mark them as property and prevent escape. The practice left permanent scars and was a constant reminder of their subjugation. In Louisiana, the Code Noir even legalized branding as a punishment for runaway slaves, with New Orleans becoming one of the largest slave markets in America in the 19th century. In Virginia, slave owners burned their initials onto the cheeks or shoulders of their property as a deterrent. Reports from historical records suggest that masters would go so far as to brand the names of the entire slave-owning family on their slaves. These practices were widespread, to the point that old brands can still be found on the descendants of slaves in regions with historically high slave populations. Today, the scars of branding serve as tangible reminders of the inhumanity and cruelty of slavery. Historical records, narratives of formerly enslaved individuals, and artifacts preserved in museums document the practice and its impact on generations of people subjected to its brutality. Remembering the history of branding is crucial to acknowledging the resilience of those who endured slavery and understanding the lasting legacies of racial injustice and exploitation. 8. Whipping and salting. Continuing the theme as livestock, the enslaved were disciplined in the similar fashion animal keepers used to tame lions and other beasts. Whipping was a common punishment for enslaved individuals, often leaving severe scars. In some cases, owners would aggravate the pain by applying substances like red pepper, turpentine, or salt to the wounds. These acts of cruelty caused immense physical pain and long-lasting trauma. In America, slaves, including pregnant women and children, were often whipped as punishment. Not only were slaves violently whipped, but sometimes the wounds would be rubbed with salt brine. Ever heard the phrase, throwing salt in the wound, to describe a bad situation made worse? This practice of whipping and salting of wounds along with other torturous methods like turpentine and hot pepper juice, was sadly common among enslaved individuals, punished for various reasons deemed appropriate by their overseers or owners. Unfortunately, some slaves even got whipped when they did nothing wrong. To their masters, in order to prevent any potential defiance, slave owners may sometimes whip their slaves even before any offense was even committed. This was seen as a way to break their spirit and prevent future transgressions. 7. Pitch capping. The practice of tying and burning slaves over hot grease, also known as pitch capping or similar terms, was a particularly gruesome form of punishment inflicted on enslaved individuals during the era of slavery. The process typically involved tying the enslaved person securely with ropes or chains and suspending them over a fire or heated grease. Sometimes, a pot containing boiling fat or grease was placed underneath the suspended individual, causing drops of scalding liquid to fall on their exposed skin. This method ensured prolonged agony and was intended not only to physically harm, but also instill fear among other enslaved individuals witnessing the punishment. Harriet Jacobs, an escaped slave, recounted the brutal punishments she witnessed. One such method involved suspending a slave over a fire with a piece of fat pork above. As the pork cooked, scalding drops of fat fell on the slave's bare skin, causing continuous pain. Pitch capping was employed predominantly in the American South, where harsh plantation conditions and the brutal enforcement of labor often led to extreme measures of punishment to maintain order and deter resistance. 6. Mutilation. The battering of the black body has historically been a popular method of punishment inflicted by Western institutions. Mutilation was one of the most common forms of extreme punishment. Enslaved individuals could have their teeth broken, fingers clamped in vices, or limbs cut off as punishment. These acts were meant to instill fear and assert control. During the Middle Passage, ship captains would resort to extreme measures of this version of brutality, especially for the recaptured slaves. Those who attempted to escape were used as gruesome warnings to others. And in the harsh conditions of sugar plantations, slaves who succumbed to exhaustion and fell asleep in the mill might have a limb cut off as an example to other slaves of the dangers of falling asleep on the job. 5. Hog's head. According to an account from a former slave who suffered and witnessed many forms of cruel punishments while enslaved, another form was considered a sadistic game. The practice of hog's head was a punishment that involved placing enslaved individuals inside large barrels with nails hammered into them, leaving the sharp ends protruding inward. The victims were then rolled down hills or slopes, causing the nails to tear into their flesh as the barrel moved. This form of punishment was particularly sadistic and was intended to inflict maximum pain and suffering. Accounts of hoghead punishment are documented in narratives and testimonies from formerly enslaved individuals. Moses Roper, in his narrative published in the mid-19th century, described witnessing such punishments being inflicted on enslaved people by their masters. These first-hand recollections provide visceral details of the horrors endured by enslaved individuals subjected to such torturous practices. In some cases, slaveholders derived sadistic pleasure from inflicting physical and psychological torment on their enslaved laborers. The brutality of hogshead punishment exemplifies the extreme violence inherent in the institution of slavery. 4. The Virginia Play. According to an escaped slave from Virginia, a certain form of punishment he encountered was considered a cruel game, forcing the victims to come within inches of their last breath. A punishment called the Virginia Play, where slaves were tied and whipped in a smokehouse, then subjected to suffocating smoke from the burning tobacco stems. This method was used to inflict maximum pain and fear. Enslaved individuals would be subjected to severe whippings or beatings, often in a public or semi-public setting. These punishments were intended not only to inflict physical pain, but also to serve as a spectacle of power and dominance by the slaveholder. After being beaten, the enslaved person would be tied up and confined in a smokehouse. Tobacco stems or other materials would be ignited to produce smoke, which would fill the small enclosed space. This act of suffocation and exposure to smoke was meant to further degrade and punish the individual. Descriptions of the Virginia Play can be found in narratives and accounts from formerly enslaved individuals, abolitionist literature, and historical records. These testimonies provide vivid and harrowing details of the brutalities endured by enslaved people under the institution of slavery. 3. Picketing. Picketing and spraddling were cruel methods of restraint and punishment used against enslaved individuals during the era of slavery in the United States. Picketing involved tying a slave's arms above their head to a tree branch or other elevated structure. This forced the enslaved person to stand on their toes for extended periods, often in uncomfortable or precarious positions. The purpose of picketing was twofold: to physically exhaust and punish the enslaved person, and to act as a public display of power and control by the slaveholder. The physical strain of picketing could lead to severe pain and long-lasting physical damage, including muscle cramps, joint problems, and even permanent disabilities. Spraddling, also known as whipping, targeted pregnant slaves, requiring them to lay face down on a shallow hole while being lashed across their back. This act not only caused immediate pain, but also led to complications during pregnancy. The severity of the whipping varied, but often resulted in deep lacerations, severe pain, and sometimes permanent physical damage. Spraddling was used as a punitive measure for perceived infractions or acts of resistance, as well as means of asserting control and discipline over enslaved populations. 2. Punishment cells. Slaves who attempted to escape or refused to work were often confined in small, airless spaces called torture chambers or punishment cells. Torture chambers were small, often windowless rooms or cells designed to inflict severe physical and psychological suffering on enslaved individuals. These spaces were intentionally constructed to maximize discomfort and isolation, depriving the enslaved of basic necessities such as light, ventilation, and sometimes even food and water. Additionally, slave owners would sometimes line the walls with spikes to prevent slaves from leaning or resting. The emotional torment inflicted by these chambers was equally damaging, as the victims were left to contemplate their fate in isolation, knowing that escape was impossible. Enslaved individuals could be confined in torture chambers for various reasons, including attempted escape, acts of disobedience, or perceived threats to the authority of slaveholders. The duration of confinement varied, ranging from hours to days or even weeks, depending on the severity of the perceived offense and the whims of the slaveholder. The psychological toll of being confined in a torture chamber was profound. Isolation, sensory deprivation, and the constant fear of further punishment contributed to feelings of despair, helplessness, and psychological trauma. Many enslaved individuals confined in these spaces experienced acute anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of their confinement. 1. Public burning. Throughout history, punishments inflicted on slaves were often public spectacles intended to instill fear and obedience in other enslaved individuals. These gruesome displays were even attended by neighboring townspeople as a form of entertainment. Among the most horrifying methods of punishment was public burning, where victims were either tied to a stake or hung above a fire. Some died from smoke inhalation before the flames reached them, while others suffered unimaginable burning agony until death finally provided release. One such instance is the tale of a slave named Jerry. In 1830, Jerry was burned in an open field with thousands of spectators. The scene included a large pile of pitch pine logs and kindling where he was chained to a stake. Despite the inhumane circumstances, Jerry reportedly prayed audibly as the flames consumed him, and his execution became notorious as the last recorded instance of burning a slave in South Carolina. Why did he receive such a punishment, you may wonder? Well, Jerry was charged with the abuse of the wife of his subcontracted master, a heavy sin indeed. While such an act is inexcusable, we also cannot excuse the fact that if a white man had done the same, he would have received a lighter punishment. And in cases where they abused enslaved women, there might not have even been a trial at all. Jerry's case, while legally sanctioned, is proof of the unequal application of justice at the time, where a black man faced the ultimate punishment for a crime that a white man would have received a lesser sentence for. These 10 examples barely scratch the surface of the unimaginable suffering endured by enslaved black people in America, the cruelty inflicted upon them, of the inhumanity that can arise when power is abused. By learning about these atrocities, we honor the memory of those who suffered and ensure that their stories are not forgotten.
All right, let's open your eyes and have a real chat about some of the darkest parts of our history. Imagine this: African men, enslaved, enduring unimaginable suffering, and at the mercy of their masters' cruel whims. While we sit here enjoying our freedoms, back then, human dignity was a distant dream for these folks. They went through unspeakable horrors, stripped of their rights, their bodies and spirits broken. We need to face these brutal truths, remember what happened, and honor those who suffered. This video will uncover 5 gut-wrenching ways these men were exploited, their sense of worth and dignity crushed in a relentless quest for dominance and control. Brace yourself, because these stories are more horrific than you could ever imagine. 5. Sexual abuse. One of the most horrific forms of the abuse experienced by enslaved African men was sexual abuse, committed by male slave owners, merchants, and overseers. These horrific acts occurred both in the United States and the Caribbean, where the slave system prevailed. These enslaved were often taken advantage of on ships during the transatlantic journey, in secret sex farms, and by way of blackmail. Due to the pervasive social norms of the time and the existing power dynamics, enslaved men faced numerous barriers to reporting their abuse. In reality, they had no rights or really no one to defend their humanity. They suffered these indignities without ever voicing their experiences out of fear of retribution or further punishment. The notion of men being overpowered by other men in itself is embarrassing in any arena. So to accuse white men who were married or had multiple partners was met with skepticism and disbelief by society. Unlike enslaved women who could become pregnant as a result of sexual violence, enslaved men did not bear visible signs of abuse, further compounding the issue. Enslaved men were also often used as tools of retribution and toys of fantasies by the wives of plantation owners. Because the owners often had affairs and non-consensual relationships with enslaved women, often producing mixed babies on the plantations, many wives would often coerce the enslaved Africans into affairs. These acts of revenge were usually plotted with the white wife threatening the enslaved by saying things like, "If you don't, I'll tell everyone you took it." Despite these challenges, accounts and testimonies have emerged to shed light on the extent of the exploitation endured by enslaved African men. In addition to the direct physical and psychological harm, sexual abuse of enslaved men also contributed to reproductive exploitation. Enslavers often exploited enslaved men's bodies for forced reproduction, seeking to increase their human property through the birth of enslaved children who would become future laborers. These narratives reveal that many were forced to engage in sexual acts with their masters' wives in the absence of their husbands. White mistresses, driven by notions of racial superiority and physical desire, exploited the strength and physique of African male slaves for their own gratification. 4. Buck breaking. One of the most horrifying practices was known as buck breaking. This method of degradation was a particularly cruel and sadistic method employed by white supremacists and slave owners to assert dominance, humiliate, and subjugate enslaved men. Mostly a practice carried out during the antebellum era in many southern parts of the Americas, especially during periods of increased slave rebellions. Buck breaking aimed to strip enslaved men of their dignity, emasculate them, and instill fear among the slave population through public sexual abuse. This practice was usually inflicted upon the biggest, strongest, and most intimidating, taking the best among the enslaved and punishing them into submission. Buck breaking typically began with the public humiliation and physical punishment of the enslaved man. Stripping him completely naked, he was subjected to severe floggings in front of an assembled crowd, mostly other slaves. This public spectacle served to dehumanize and embarrass the individual, reducing him to a mere object of terror, shame, and amusement. Following the flogging, the enslaved man would be sexually violated by the slave owner or a designated buck breaker. This act of sexual violence was intended to assert dominance, reinforce the power dynamics of slavery, and send a chilling message to other slaves who might dare to resist. There have been many documented accounts of those who survived and witnessed these horrific acts. Sons who were forced to witness the brutal assaults of their fathers, forever scarred by the image of their leader reduced to objects of sexual abuse. Frederick Douglass did not personally experience buck breaking, but witnessed its occurrence and eloquently described the brutalities inflicted upon enslaved men in his autobiographical works. Harriet Jacobs, a former enslaved African American, exposed the sexual abuse inflicted upon male slaves in her writings, highlighting the systemic and pervasive nature of this exploitation. A lot of these punishments have been recreated through movies over the decades. Many films like 12 Years a Slave, Mandingo, and Roots recreate these heinous acts, while other films like Pulp Fiction have scenes that interpret some of these historical practices. Echoes of the sentiments of these acts, including public humiliation, buck breaking, abuse, and degradation, can be interpreted in different forms outside of the physical manifestations of the antebellum South. Now back to our list. 3. Breeding farms. During the abolitionist movement, when efforts were being made to curtail the transatlantic slave trade and emancipate enslaved individuals, plantation owners faced a significant challenge: a shortage of labor. Desperate to maintain their economic interests, they resorted to creating breeding farms, specifically designed to exploit the sexuality of enslaved African men. These men, chosen for their physical strength and reproductive potential, were subjected to unimaginable sexual abuse. On these breeding farms, enslaved men were made to engage in sexual acts with multiple women daily to increase the likelihood of impregnation. This systematic breeding often forced incest upon slave families, with slaves given hoods or bags over their heads to prevent them from knowing who they were forced to have sex with. The goal was to produce children who could be sold, a practice that naturally broke the psyche of slave families. The practice of forced breeding had profound and devastating consequences for enslaved individuals, particularly women. They endured physical and emotional trauma from frequent pregnancies, childbirth complications, and the separation from their children who were often sold to other slave owners. Enslaved men also faced the dehumanizing reality of being used solely for reproductive purposes, further undermining their autonomy and dignity. Frederick Douglass and Charles Ball, both formerly enslaved individuals, provide first-hand accounts of the horrors of the slave breeding system. Their narratives describe the cruel separation of families, with children torn from their parents and sold off, and the dehumanizing nature of their experiences. The infamous Pierce Butler, a plantation owner from South Carolina, operated one of the most notorious slave breeding farms, Butler Island Plantation. The history of Butler Island and other breeding farms underscore the dehumanizing nature of slavery and its profound impact on generations of African Americans. It serves as a stark reminder of the systematic exploitation and violence that characterized the plantation economy in the antebellum South. 2. Mutilation. The black man's natural prowess has been perceived a threat since the first African men touched the shores of the Americas. Enslaved African men were seen as a constant sexual threat to white masters due to their strength and vitality. The fear of rebellion, coupled with the perceived sexual prowess of African men, fueled the desire to exert control over their bodies. One of the most abhorrent methods employed was mutilation, in particularly castration, which served as a form of punishment, subjugation, and psychological control. Remember how blackmail was so effective against them? Here's why. Castration was often a response to alleged sexual transgressions. Even still, if they were caught with master's wife or daughter, it was off with their legacy maker. This brutal act aimed to emasculate and dehumanize the individual while asserting the dominance of the white master. Historical records and personal testimonies provide chilling accounts of the castration of enslaved African men. Men who demonstrated leadership qualities or were involved in rebellious activities were particularly targeted, with the goal of undermining their authority and diminishing their perceived threat. 1. Entertaining sex. Throughout the history of slavery, white supremacists, wealthy merchants, and aristocrats frequently treated enslaved men as sexual objects, denying them agency over their own bodies. These men were stripped of their dignity and humanity, forced to endure a wide array of sexual abuses and acts of degradation. One particularly degrading practice was the public display of enslaved men's bodies for the amusement of white viewers. These men were often made to line up naked, their sexual organs exposed, as they were scrutinized, laughed at, and discussed by their white masters and spectators. This blatant objectification reinforced the notion of African men as subordinate beings and perpetuated a culture of white dominance and black subjugation. Enslaved African men were also subjected to forced sexual acts with enslaved women, often under the guise of entertainment. In extreme cases, an enslaved man would be forcibly made to engage in sexual intercourse with an enslaved virgin in front of a white audience, satisfying the voyeuristic desires of white viewers. Frederick Douglass and Solomon Northup, two prominent figures who escaped slavery, documented their experiences, providing disturbing accounts of the exploitation endured by enslaved African men. Their narratives highlight the systemic and pervasive nature of these abuses, rooted in the dehumanization inherent in the slave system. By confronting the painful history of the indecent exploitation endured by enslaved African men, we strive for a more comprehensive understanding of the atrocities committed during the era of slavery. This knowledge allows us to acknowledge the resilience and strength of those who suffered under such brutal conditions, and serves as a reminder of the importance of combating racism and promoting equality in our society today. As always, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share our videos to let more people know the truth about Black history and to hear their own part of the narratives. Thank you for watching.